Gary Gibbon, our political editor, we're going to talk about Rishi Sunak's new Brexit deal and what it all means. What are you going to tell me?
Rishi Sunak surprised his party, surprised the country on the upside, getting more out of the European Union negotiation than Boris Johnson looked like he was ever going to get. And the question now is, as people pore over it, will the DUP think it's enough? Will his Conservative MPs think it's enough? Will it actually open up a whole new chapter in our relations with Europe?
Gary, I want to start by talking about the fact that this deal, it was on the cards. People were murmuring about it for a number of days and weeks leading up to the announcement of it on Monday, the 27th. I mean, Sunak became Prime Minister at the end of October last year. Has him and his team been working on this? Has this been a crucial thing for them to do, apart from, of course, dealing with the fallout from the mini budget? Has this been centre of his focus?
It does look as though this was in Rishi Sunak's mind almost the moment he walked in the door into number 10. In pretty short order after he was through the door, you remember it wasn't clear whether he was going to go to the COP27 meeting in Egypt. He did go in the end, and when he was there, he met Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, and said to her in terms he was really keen to do a deal. We understand that in Egypt, Rishi Sunak gave assurances that he would abandon the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill. That's the piece of legislation that Boris Johnson had set on its merry way through Parliament, which had got to the Lords and which effectively shredded the entire Northern Ireland Protocol and which the European Union hated. Well, Rishi Sunak saying as a gesture of good faith he would pause, suspend, eventually abandon that, really struck the Europeans as a gesture of good faith. Their interest was aroused that he was up for a serious negotiation. In very short number of days after being in Egypt, Rishi Sunak's in Bali at the G20 telling President Biden to his face there's been American pressure to do a deal here for a long time and settle things and get the institutions in Northern Ireland up and running again, never more so than under President Biden. He tells Rishi Sunak, President Biden to his face, I am determined to get a deal before the anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, which falls in April. So it does look as though all of this started really early in Rishi Sunak's premiership, very much at the front of his mind.
You touched upon there on the Northern Ireland Protocol, the one arranged by Boris Johnson, which caused so many divisions, disagreements in Ireland and Northern Ireland, and of course from the Americans. Can you just explain that protocol and why it was so divisive?
Boris Johnson went for a deal which treated Northern Ireland separately from the rest of the United Kingdom. Under the terms that the European Union managed to frame the whole Brexit negotiations in, either the whole of the UK was going to remain aligned with the European Union, or one part of it was, Northern Ireland, in order to keep the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland as a non-event, something you could cross without any sort of impediment, without any check. Boris Johnson, having chosen that route, that the whole of the United Kingdom was not going to align with the European Union, but Northern Ireland was, the protocol was effectively the whole load of assurances that the European Union wanted to make that happen, to keep that border free. And effectively what that meant was you put some kind of border, some kind of checks between Britain and Northern Ireland itself. And Boris Johnson's contested that what the European Union had done in that deal, which he signed, and their interpretation of it subsequently was far too strict and was onerous on exports from GB to Northern Ireland and just shouldn't be in the stringent form in which they were making it reality. And that was the source of this entire controversy. How do you protect the single market, but at the same time keep that border between Northern Ireland and Ireland utterly free?
And so with this Windsor framework, is the main resolution, therefore, that what we now have is a green lane and a red lane when it comes to that trade route?
If the European Union had had its original way, there were going to be checks galore. There was already paperwork galore for people who wanted to move things from Britain to Northern Ireland. There would be even more checks. They were being held back. There was a grace period, an adjustment period that was in play at the beginning, and Britain kept sort of extending that. So not all the checks were there yet, but the checks that the European Union intended to throw at any sort of export, almost any export that was going GB to Northern Ireland, were pretty onerous. And what the Green Channel, Red Channel innovation in this Windsor framework does is say, actually, vast majority of stuff, probably only intended for Northern Ireland, can go through the Green Channel, won't be stopped, won't be checked. If you're intending to take on some of your consignment or all of your consignment into the Republic, into the single market, into the EU, then you will be subject to checks. There are all sorts of other things that go with this, including labelling, and an awful lot of the reason you'll be trusted to go through the Green Channel is because you have applied for and acquired trusted trader status, and that won't be entirely straightforward. That could be quite onerous in itself. The EU has exacted some things in return for the relaxation at the border, that sort of impact at the border between Britain and Northern Ireland, which of course unionists really don't want to see as a border at all. So there have been some quid pro quos in all of this, but the overall effect is that an awful lot of stuff will just be flowing much more freely than it was going to do, and there will be less paperwork, but we have yet to see how much less.
And the big question is that it may be less onerous, but we still don't know necessarily the physical infrastructure that might be at the ports in Northern Ireland, which is still going to have to be constructed or to deal with these green and red lanes.
There were drawings submitted by the government, quite a few, I mean, like a year and a half ago or something like that, for stuff they wanted to build, checkpoints they wanted to build at Larne. There are a couple of other points where they could pop up, I think. And then, interestingly, again, as part of all the choreography of the deal with Northern Ireland emerging, in the last day of Parliament sitting just before Christmas, the government moved a statutory instrument, basically a way of putting something into law which doesn't require a vote in the normal procedures of Parliament, to push ahead with these checkpoints.
If this protocol was so, bad, why was it agreed to in the first place?
Well, Boris Johnson and some of his allies have said the reason they signed up to it is because there was an awful lot of pressure to get a Brexit deal done at the time. Think back to the end of 2019, and it's still post-traumatic stress for some of us to think back to the end of that whole sort of Brexit era. There was a lot of stress. There was an immediate need to get something done as far as he was concerned. There were pressures from the other side to try and stop Brexit happening altogether. That's how it seemed to him. But also, very tellingly, interestingly, I spoke to one MP who, on the night of the vote on this deal, was called into Boris Johnson's office, and Boris Johnson said to him, don't worry about all these sort of rules that the EU intend to impose, the border checks and the rest of it. I don't intend to implement that. You see, the other side of all of this, I'm going to sort of weigh in, and I'll find some wheezes to stop this happening. And he did try some wheezes, but they didn't quite work. They did hold off the big tide of regulation for a while because he kept extending those grace periods, the transition periods during which all the checks weren't necessarily implied. But he never got a deal quite like the one that Rishi Sunak has come back with.
The former Brexit Secretary David Davis said, Rishi Sunak has got a better deal than Boris Johnson. Why do you think that is? Or when you speak to individuals involved in the negotiations, why is that? Is it simply that, perhaps if you aren't as confrontational as perhaps Mr. Johnson was, you can actually get something done?
That is certainly what the European Union is putting out in messaging. And you could detect it in Ursula von der Leyen speaking at the Windsor Guildhall before she went off to see the King on Monday. Very much the choice of words she was using. You have been honest. You have been painstaking over detail, Mr. Sunak. Or dear Rishi, as she called him. You've been this, you've been that. And all of it, you couldn't help thinking, was meant to be a sort of pointed, unspoken comparison with Boris Johnson, who she clearly didn't trust and Brussels didn't trust. And there was an issue of trust. But there are some other things in play here. At the very beginning of this whole process, the European Union, there was still bitterness in the European Union about Brexit. That sort of subsides a bit over time. And there's another phenomenon here, which people close to the talks tell me was in play. The European Union was genuinely worried about Northern Ireland being some sort of smuggler's superhighway, which would sort of jettison goods and catapult them into the single market and the European Union. And over time, they've begun to see that that might not be the case.
And, in a lot of the discussions about this deal, we compare what Mr. Sunak has managed to get with what Boris Johnson got. But I always think, and she has endorsed this agreement, of Theresa May and all those countless votes and those discussions and whether we were going to have a soft Brexit, a hard Brexit, a Canada deal, a Switzerland deal, whatever. How does this current framework compare to what Theresa May was trying to get?
What Theresa May initially was trying to get was maybe something that was a bit like this, but she then moved to a plan where effectively the whole of the United Kingdom was going to stay much more closely aligned with the European Union until such time as they could work out a way out of all of that, i.e. technology or some other agreement. But there was going to be, her Chequers deal would have kept the whole of the UK aligned with the EU. That was unacceptable to lots of hard Brexiteers in the Tory party. Boris Johnson comes in, tries to finesse, again, a sort of halfway house between the two, but doesn't manage that and ends up plumping for this deal, which puts Northern Ireland in a different place. And ever since then, people have been trying to sort of claw back something that will make Unionists in Northern Ireland feel better about this otherness of their position in the United Kingdom, which is unarguable. It is in there. It is in the original agreement. And although there are some significant changes that are made to that original agreement, it has not been totally rewritten.
A lot of has been made of this framework and what Mr. Sunak said this week, saying that Northern Ireland is now in the unbelievably special position, unique position in the entire world, in having privileged access not just to the UK market, but also the EU single market. Is that him, on the one hand, admitting, as has been interpreted, the benefits of the single market, which makes you question why he was a Brexiteer, but also doesn't that just clearly show that Northern Ireland is still very different here and it still has to go along with some much smaller number of EU rules?
It is very different. A lot of Remainers have hit upon this language that Rishi Sunak was using in that enthusiastic sort of head boy management consultant sort of way that he does, as he was trying to enthuse his crowd into the future of Northern Ireland under the deal that he's negotiated, saying, as you said, you get the best of both worlds. You're in the United Kingdom but in the single market. There are people, even in the DUP, who I've heard use similar language. Some of them even said it in public quite a while ago. You have to look back a long way to find them saying it. Best of both worlds was something that occurred to a few of them and occurred to quite a few business people. And if you can reduce the burdens on east-west, west-east trade traffic between Northern Ireland and Britain, which remains the biggest market for people who make things in Northern Ireland, well, then there might be something to it. It might well hold a unique place in the economy of Western Europe. And it's no accident, I don't think, that we're now hearing talk of not only how the European Union is interested in trying to encourage people to invest in Northern Ireland if this whole thing goes ahead, as it looks like it will, but America too. And there's a St. Patrick's Day gathering, as there is every year in Washington. And this year, Jeffrey Donaldson is going over there, the DUP leader, because he knows there's a tantalising amount of money on offer in investment for Northern Ireland if this whole deal goes ahead.
Given that the DUP at one point held all the cards, especially within Theresa May's government, because they propped up her government, and we've gone through this very long process. Do you think, has the DUP played the Brexit game well, do they think?
There were always conversations you had way back at the time, the build-up to the Brexit vote, the Brexit referendum campaign. Some in the DUP thought, definitely some, that Brexit wouldn't happen, but they could parade their consciences and feel comfortable supporting a Brexit campaign. The realities of what it meant when it came then started getting talked about, best of both worlds, but then the realities of best of both worlds turned out to be a whole load of controls at the border, which then became an enormous impassioned campaign with marches through towns in Northern Ireland and posters up and enormous pressure on the DUP to not only say that they wanted the protocol changed, but at times they let it slip their tongue, they wanted it ripped up. Well, they haven't got it ripped up, they've got it changed, and they've now got to make their minds up whether they can live with that or whether they really think something better will happen one day that they like even more. And that's one of the big pressures on them at the moment. Peter Robinson, the former leader of the DUP, saying on a Facebook message yesterday, big figure in the DUP, someone Geoffrey Donaldson, I suspect, will be hoping will shift votes towards him if he decides to go for this deal. Him saying what we've got to calculate is in all our cogitations about this is what actually do we get if we don't go with this, and that could mean the DUP out of power sharing for a long time, no power sharing happening, and the danger there for the DUP is that it makes it easier for Sinn Féin to point at Northern Ireland and say, well, this is an entity that doesn't work.
So let's finally then, Gary, talk about the Conservative Party and the ERG, the hard Brexiteers. What are they saying at the moment?
Well, let's start with the ERG because their whole sort of energy was based on rejection, criticism and total rejection of the European Union if you go back many years, and then it builds up to the actual Brexit process when they come absolutely so they get the referendum because of their Euroscepticism, they get Brexit, and they then try to get the type of Brexit that they want, and this enormous sort of party within a party in the Conservative Parliamentary Party, which has been a phenomenon of recent times. And the ERG effectively in Boris Johnson got the leader they wanted. They got the type of Brexit they wanted, even though they didn't like all the implications of the checks, and they would have backed Boris Johnson trying to rip up the protocol that he'd signed. And then, interestingly, in Liz Truss, remember her? They got the government of their dreams. And it didn't work. It collapsed. And there was a sense that the ERG had completely collapsed, deflated with that moment and lost their influence because their ultimate plan of government had been tried and failed. That was definitely an atmosphere around you caught around Parliament. And you'd had ERG, very senior ERG people would acknowledge and say that to you. Then it looked as though, just as Rishi Sunak was building up to announcing his plan, as though he might be resuscitating the ERG by accident. I was standing outside one of their meetings. 40 MPs turned up, 10 peers, Geoffrey Donaldson, and you were getting this feeling that maybe, just maybe, he'd actually by accident revived the beast. It doesn't feel like that now. It feels as though so many of them want to think the best of this deal, don't want to put pressure on the DUP to go further than they want to. If the DUP decides it doesn't want to revolt, well, the ERG, or most of them, don't want to be the ones revolting and outflanking them. And there is this exhaustion with Brexit. Even the ERG, it seems, or maybe some of it, can be exhausted by Brexit, and a desperate wish to move on, have the thing finally done. And that sense, Rishi Sunak said this when he was in front of backbench MPs on Tuesday night, a sense that the public are truly sick of this.
Is that then the sense, Gary, that if this was the old ERG from a few years ago, when it comes to this idea of, Northern Ireland having the best of both worlds by still, having access to the single market, and ideas about the Stormont break perhaps not being used that regularly, the old ERG would have had issues with that? The
lapsing of time, the exhaustion, the sense that the DUP are not, it's not like a sort of World War I offensive where they're looking down and saying, right, we're all going over the top. The ERG is saying we want to stop and pause and think about this. So they're not getting the sort of clarion cry from them. It's all of those things combining along with I think that Liz Truss moment. We won't be quite like Switzerland, where our arrangements with the European Union are forever, it seems, weekly, daily revisited and rearranged. The European Union won't let us go there. It was absolutely clear it didn't want that sort of arrangement with us. They find it debilitating as well. But there will be elements of our relationship that are changing all the time, and an incoming Keir Starmer government, if there was to be one, might move them in a different direction from the ones we know. But it does feel as though the ERG, as we have known them, this enormous sort of force in British political life, a chapter in that story may be ending.
We haven't heard yet from Boris Johnson as we speak. And you said the other day on the programme that this could, as you've just alluded to there, finally be the end of that fraught relationship between the Conservative Party and the European Union, stretching back decades. Could it be that? Or, as you say, are there still these sort of various issues that may pop up time and time again?
Yeah, I don't think it's the end of a fraught relationship between the Conservative Party and Europe. I mean, some of the language that gets used in private and in public is very striking. But it could be the beginning of a better phase of relations. As for Boris Johnson, it was very telling how he dipped his toe at one remove in a friend of Boris Johnson saying, not him writing an article, he knows how to do these gradations of involvement in an issue. He chose not to write an article saying what Rishi Sunak is coming up with is rubbish, and even when he saw it, he chose not to say that. He did at one remove say, I think we should probably hold on to the protocol bill. A friend of Boris Johnson says he is at the centre of the narrative quite often. He's box office for newspapers, sometimes for telly as well, let's be honest. And the best way of doing that is to conserve your capital when it doesn't look like you'd have a very good outing deploying it. And it feels right at this moment as though the Rishi Sunak Windsor framework is not opposing that, is not a cause that would bring Boris Johnson an army of supporters and make him look particularly loved. So I suspect he is going to, as things stand, he's going to stay out of this. I mean, it's all possible still that the DUP stare at this for too long. All sorts of opposition bubbles up in Northern Ireland to it, and they decide to oppose it, and a whole load of sort of Tory MPs coalesce around them, and Boris Johnson puts himself at the head of it. That is not how it feels right now. It feels right now as though the DUP are seriously pondering, senior figures in the DUP are seriously pondering the idea of supporting this and going back into Stormont. But that it is a very divided party on this one. It is very difficult to navigate the way to pulling them together. And that bit of the equation, which Rishi Sunak always said was one of his great prizes, getting Stormont up and running again, that is still a tall order as we speak now.
Gary Gibbon, our political editor, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you.